village of Azura erupted in joyful celebration as the village chief's wife, Neoma, gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The village chief, Obina, was overjoyed at the arrival of his son, and the entire village joined in the celebration. For days, the village was filled with music, dancing, and feasting. The villagers gathered at the chief's compound, bringing gifts and well wishes for the new family. Neoma and Obina were overjoyed, basking in the love and adoration of their people. As the celebrations continued, Neoma couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She had always been a cautious person, and the thought of her baby being in harm's way kept her up at night. To alleviate her fears, Neoma decided to mark her baby with a small, intricate sign on his left shoulder. It was a traditional mark, passed down through generations of her family, and she hoped it would serve as a protection for her child. The mark was a small, delicate drawing of a sun, symbolizing life and prosperity. Neoma carefully drew the mark on her baby's shoulder, using a special ink made from natural herbs. The sun began to set on the third day of celebrations. A mysterious stranger was seen lurking around the village. He was tall and lean, with a scar above his left eyebrow. He kept to himself, but his eyes seemed to be fixed on the chief's compound. No one suspected a thing, too caught up in the joy of the moment. But little did they know, this stranger was not just any ordinary visitor. He had been sent by Uchenna, the chief's brother, with a sinister mission. As the stranger snuck into the chief's compound, avoiding the guards, and making his way to the nursery where the baby prince lay sleeping, Neoma's heart sank. She had been right to be cautious, and now her worst fears were coming true. Without making a sound, the stranger snatched the baby from his crib and disappeared into the night. The villagers were oblivious to the danger that had just struck, still caught up in their celebrations. But Neoma and Obina soon realized that something was amiss. They searched the compound frantically, but there was no sign of their son. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Little did they know, their baby was now in the hands of a stranger, marked with a small sign that would one day lead him back to his true family. Neoma was frantic with worry. She searched every corner of the compound, calling out her son's name. But there was only silence. Obina, too, was beside himself. He ordered the guards to search the entire village, but there was no sign of the baby prince. As the night wore on, the villagers began to realize that something was terribly wrong. They gathered at the chief's compound, anxious and frightened. Neoma was inconsolable. She had never felt such a deep sense of loss and fear. She kept thinking of her son, wondering where he was and if he was safe. Just as the villagers were about to give up hope, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was one of the village elders, a wise and kind man named Baba. "I have found something," Baba said, his voice low and serious. "A piece of cloth caught in a bush near the village gate. It's a piece of the baby's clothing." The villagers gasped in shock. It was clear that the baby had been taken out of the village. Obina's face darkened with anger. "We will find whoever did this," he vowed. "And we will make them pay." But little did Obina know, the enemy was closer than he thought. In fact, the enemy was standing right in front of him, smiling and pretending to be concerned. It was Uchenna, Obina's own brother. He had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. Uchenna's eyes met Obina's, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Obina had no idea that his own brother was behind the kidnapping. But Uchenna knew that he had to be careful. He couldn't let Obina suspect anything. So he smiled and nodded, pretending to be concerned about the missing baby. "We will find the baby," Uchenna said. "Don't worry, brother." Obina nodded, unaware of the evil that lurked behind Uchenna's smile. The stranger, still clutching the baby prince, made his way deep into the forest. He had been instructed to leave the baby there, where he would be vulnerable to the dangers of the wild. Finally, the stranger arrived at a clearing and gently laid the baby down on a bed of leaves. He looked around cautiously, making sure no one was watching, before turning and disappearing into the darkness. The baby prince lay there, helpless and alone, as the forest grew darker and more menacing. The sounds of the wild grew louder, and the baby's cries echoed through the trees. As the night wore on, the baby's cries grew weaker, and the forest grew quieter. It seemed as though the baby prince would soon become just another victim of the wild. Meanwhile, back at the village, Uchenna was growing increasingly anxious. He knew that Obina would stop at nothing to find his son, and he was worried that his own involvement would be discovered. Uchenna knew that he had to act fast. He couldn't let Obina continue to search for the baby, or he would surely uncover the truth. As he pondered his next move, a sinister plan began to form in his mind. He would poison Obina, making it look like an accident. That way, he would leave no trace, and no one would ever suspect him of the crime. Uchenna's eyes narrowed as he thought about the perfect way to carry out his plan. He knew that Obina's favorite food was a traditional dish called akara, and he also knew that the king's personal chef, a kind old woman named Ngozi, was deeply loyal to Obina. But Uchenna also knew that Ngozi had a weakness, her granddaughter, a young girl named Idago, who worked as a maid in the palace. Uchenna had been secretly bribing Idago, using her to gather information about the palace and its occupants. Now, Uchenna planned to use Idago to carry out his evil plan. He would instruct her to poison Obina's akara, making sure that the king would eat it and succumb to the poison. As Uchenna finalized his plan, a sense of calm washed over him. He knew that he would soon be the ruler of Azura, and that no one would ever suspect him of the crime. As the night wore on, the forest grew darker and more menacing. The baby prince lay helpless and alone, his cries echoing through the trees. Just as it seemed like all hope was lost, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a hunter, dressed in worn leather armor and carrying a long bow and quiver of arrows. He was from a neighboring kingdom, and had been tracking a deer through the forest. As he approached the clearing where the baby lay, he heard a faint rustling in the underbrush. He drew his bow, ready to strike, thinking that he had finally found his prey. But as he peered into the darkness, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. It was a small, helpless creature, lying on the forest floor. At first, the hunter thought it was a wild animal, perhaps a rabbit or a squirrel. But as he looked closer, he saw that it was a baby, wrapped in a small cloth and lying on a bed of leaves. The hunter's eyes widened in surprise as he realized that this was no wild animal, but a human child. He quickly lowered his bow and approached the baby, his heart filled with compassion. He gently picked up the baby and cradled him in his arms, speaking softly to comfort him. As he looked down at the baby's face, he saw that he was a beautiful child, with bright eyes and soft, smooth skin. The hunter knew that he had to find the baby's parents, but for now, he would take care of him as his own. The hunter, whose name was Okoro, began to make his way back to his kingdom, the baby prince safely in his arms. He had no idea that this chance discovery would change his life forever, and that the baby he had found would one day become a great leader. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Uchenna was putting his plan into action. He had instructed Idago to poison Obina's akara, and she had agreed to carry out the task. Uchenna was confident that his plan would succeed, and that he would soon be the ruler of Azura. Uchenna's plan was set in motion as Idago, the maid, snuck into the kitchen and poisoned Obina's akara. The king, unaware of the danger lurking in his food, ate the akara and soon began to feel a creeping sense of illness. At first, it was just a faint feeling of nausea, but as the hours passed, Obina's condition rapidly deteriorated. He fell into a deep fever, his body racked with pain and his mind clouded with confusion. The kingdom's doctors and healers were summoned to the palace, but none of them could diagnose the cause of the king's illness. They tried every remedy they knew, but nothing seemed to work. As the king's condition continued to worsen, the kingdom's elders gathered in an emergency meeting to discuss the crisis. According to the kingdom's laws, the throne could not remain vacant for even a day. A new king had to be appointed, and fast. The elders looked at each other nervously, knowing that the king's son, the baby prince, was the rightful heir to the throne. But the baby prince was nowhere to be found, and the kingdom was in chaos. Uchenna, who had been watching the events unfold from the shadows, smiled to himself. His plan was working perfectly. The king was out of the way, and the kingdom was in disarray. Now, all he had to do was wait for the elders to appoint him as the new king. And with the baby prince gone, no one would ever suspect him of the crime. The kingdom's elders, unaware of Uchenna's treachery, appointed him as the new king. Uchenna accepted the throne, his heart filled with joy and ambition. He knew that he had achieved his goal, and that nothing could stop him now. But far away from the kingdom, in a small village on the outskirts of the forest, the baby prince was growing up under the care of Okoro, the hunter. Okoro had named him Ajogo, and had raised him as his own son. Years passed, and Ajogo grew into a strong and skillful young man. He had learned everything from Okoro, from hunting and tracking to combat and survival skills. Ajogo was a natural warrior, and Okoro couldn't be prouder of him. As Ajogo approached adulthood, Okoro began to notice that he had a special gift, a mark on his left shoulder that seemed to glow with an inner light. Okoro had seen the mark before, but he had never known what it meant. One day, Okoro decided to tell Ajogo the truth about his past. He revealed to him that he was not his real son, but a prince from a faraway kingdom. Ajogo was shocked and amazed, but he was also curious. He asked Okoro to tell him more about his kingdom and his family. Okoro told him everything he knew, from the stories he had heard from travelers and traders. Ajogo's heart was filled with a sense of wonder and purpose. He knew that he had to return to his kingdom. But he also knew that it wouldn't be easy, and that people might not even believe he is one of them. Ajogo took Okoro's advice to heart, deciding to focus on his hunting and lifestyle instead of rushing back to his kingdom. He spent his days honing his skills, exploring the forest, and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. Ajogo was out hunting, his senses alert as he trekked through the forest. He had been tracking a deer for hours, but it had managed to evade him so far. As he approached the river, he heard a faint cry for help. He rushed to the riverbank, his heart racing with excitement and concern. As he peered into the water, he saw a figure struggling to stay afloat. It was a woman, her long hair flowing like seaweed in the current. Ajogo didn't hesitate, plunging into the river to rescue her. The water was icy cold, but Ajogo's hunting instincts kicked in, and he swam towards the woman with ease. He grabbed hold of her, pulling her close to his chest, and began to swim back to shore. As they emerged from the water, Ajogo couldn't help but notice the woman's striking features. She was beautiful, with piercing green eyes and skin as pale as the moon. But it was her clothing that really caught his attention. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, with intricate embroidery and strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Ajogo's curiosity was piqued. Who was this mysterious woman, and what was she doing in the river? He laid her down on the grassy bank, trying to catch his breath, and asked her, "What happened? How did you end up in the river?" The woman coughed, water spewing from her mouth, and looked up at Ajogo with a mixture of gratitude and fear in her eyes. "I thought I was running," she stammered. "I had to escape. They were chasing me." Ajogo's instincts told him that something was off. Who was chasing her, and why? He looked around, but the forest seemed quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. He turned back to the woman, his eyes locked on hers. "Who was chasing you?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting back and forth, as if searching for an escape route. And then, in a whisper, she said, "The prince's men." Ajogo helped the woman to her feet, and she leaned on him heavily as they made their way through the forest. "I'm Ajogo," he said, smiling at her. "And you are?" The woman smiled back at him, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "I'm Neka," she said. "Thank you for saving me, Ajogo." Ajogo nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're welcome, Neka. Where do you live?" "I'll make sure you get home safely." Neka pointed to a small hut on the outskirts of the forest. "I live in that compound," she said. "My parents will be worried sick about me." Ajogo nodded, and together they made their way to the village. As they walked, Ajogo couldn't help but notice the way Neka's hair fell in loose waves down her back, or the way her eyes sparkled in the sunlight. He felt a pang of attraction, but he pushed it aside. He was just happy to have saved her, and to be able to return her to her parents safely. Meanwhile, the prince of that kingdom, whose name was Kambili, was furious that his men had failed to capture Neka. He was in love with her and had been searching for her for weeks. He was determined to make her his queen. But what Prince Kambili didn't know was that Nneka was now under Ajogo's protection. And Ajogo would stop at nothing to keep her safe. Prince Kambili's face turned red with rage as he shouted at his guards. "How could you allow her to escape?" he thundered. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," one of the guards stammered. "She ran past us before we could catch her." The prince's eyes narrowed. "How can a young lady outrun 5 men?" he sneered. "You are all incompetent fools. I want you to find out where she is staying and bring her back to me." The guards nodded hastily and scurried off to carry out the prince's orders. The prince watched them go, his mind still seething with anger and frustration. He had been in love with Nneka for months, but she had consistently rejected his advances. He was determined to make her his woman, no matter what it took. Meanwhile, Ajogo was walking back to his village, a silly grin still plastered on his face. He couldn't stop thinking about Nneka, the beautiful lady he had just saved. He had never seen anyone like her before. She was so brave and strong, despite being in a desperate situation. As he walked, Ajogo found himself wondering what Nneka's story was. Why was she running from the prince's guards? And what was she doing all alone in the forest? He shook his head, chuckling to himself. He would probably never see her again, but he was glad he had been able to help her. Little did Ajogo know, their paths would cross again soon. And next time, their encounter would change everything. Nneka sat in her room, thinking about how she could show her gratitude to Ajogo for saving her. She had been thinking about it all day, and she finally had an idea. She would prepare a delicious meal and take it to his house as a thank you gift. She quickly got to work, cooking up a storm in the kitchen. She made his favorite dish, jollof rice with chicken, and even baked some sweet plantains to go with it. As she worked, she couldn't help but think about Ajogo and how handsome he had looked when he saved her. Finally, the meal was ready, and Nneka carefully packed it into a basket. She made her way to Ajogo's house, feeling a little nervous, but also excited. When she arrived, Ajogo answered the door himself, looking surprised, but pleased to see her. "Nneka, what brings you here?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. Nneka smiled and held out the basket. "I brought you a meal as a thank you for saving me," she said. "I hope you like it." Ajogo's eyes lit up as he took the basket from her. "Thank you so much, Nneka," he said. "You didn't have to do that." He invited her to sit down, and they ate the meal together. Ajogo complimented her on her cooking, saying it was the best meal he had had in a long time. Nneka blushed and smiled, feeling happy that he was enjoying the food. As they ate, Ajogo couldn't help but steal glances at Nneka. She was even more beautiful up close, with sparkling eyes and smooth, dark skin. He found himself feeling drawn to her, and he couldn't understand why. After they finished eating, Nneka noticed the mark on Ajogo's hand. "What's that mark on your hand?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her.